From Nina Hamnett, the scandalously fabulous Queen of Bohemia, to Augustus John, the eccentric artist who dubbed the Fitz the Clapham Junction of the world, today's pub visit has more characters than a Dickens novel. This is Andy Meddick, podcast producer, and you're listening to the Historic London Pubcast. Welcome to a pub where literary legends downed pints like prose, artists debated over double rums, and poets handed out verses on beer mats like carefree souvenirs. In this episode of the Historic London Pubcast, we're zeroing in on the Fitzroy Tavern, a cornerstone of Bohemian Fitzrovia and a magnet for the misfits, visionaries, and creatives that made the area buzz between the wars. You'll hear about the pub's unlikely journey from a coffee house in 1883 to a hub of Bohemian London, thanks to a German tailor turned publican named Judah Kleinfeld, who couldn't write English but could run a legendary bar. There's also Dylan Thomas, who may have penned some of his best lines at the Fitz, and possibly lost them after a pint too many. And even Albert Pierrepoint, Britain's most prolific executioner, who preferred a quiet pint over publicity, unless, of course, he was wrongly accused of drinking on the job. Yep, it's that kind of place. We'll raise a glass to the artists, rebels, and storytellers who made this watering hole legendary, and maybe even throw a dart or two at the ceiling in honor of the pennies from heaven tradition. So pull up a bar stool, keep your drink steady, and get ready for a tale that's just fizzing with history. Host and guide Eric Blair will take us from here.
Welcome to this episode of the Historic London Pubcast. I'm Eric Blair, and I'd like to take you on a journey through the rich history of London's iconic pubs. My goal is to share with you my passion for the great old pubs of London. I want to give you some facts to help you appreciate the history of these hallowed establishments, mixed in with some fun stories that make it all go down as smooth as a well-poured pint. In the episode today and the next one, we're going to explore some historic pubs in what is known as Fitzrovia. Today, we'll just talk about the Fitzroy Tavern and its rich history. In the next episode, we'll cover some neighboring pubs, the Wheatsheaf, the Marquis of Granby, the Newman Arms, and the Museum Tavern. Okay, that last pub is really in Bloomsbury, but it's just over the fence, and it works well to visit in this grouping. Let's start with the name Fitzrovia itself. It applies to the area west of Bloomsbury and north of Soho. It was given its name in the 1930s by Tom Dryburgh, a fellow with a lot of descriptors according to Wikipedia, a journalist, long-serving MP, that's Member of Parliament, High Anglican churchman, 20-year member of the British Communist Party before his Labour Party MP days, and possibly a Soviet spy. Check Wiki for further details. We're mentioning him here for his nomenclature skills. The name came to Tom from either Fitzroy Square or, more likely, the Fitzroy Tavern, which Dryburgh was known to be a longtime patron of. The Fitzroy Tavern became the heart of the district, particularly in the years between the two world wars. It attracted artists, writers, composers, poets, all embracing a bohemian or libertine attitude that made Fitzrovia, London's answer to Café Society of Paris. If you check out the 2-minute trailer episode of this pubcast series, you heard me describe the 4 features of pubs that are covered here. Abbreviated AALP, the big 4 are architecture, antiquity, legend, and personalities. The Fitzroy Tavern doesn't have much claim to special architecture or hundreds of years of antiquity, but the famous folks associated with the pub and the stories about them more than make up for it. But I will say that architecture feature has improved quite a bit in the last 10 years, so we'll get to that. Let me briefly describe how this area came about. In 1667, Charles II, you might say he was the original Bohemian, had appropriated the land of the folks that were on the outs with him when he ascended to the throne. In 1667, he gave the land to what would become Fitzrovia to his principal Secretary of State, Henry Bennet, Earl of Arlington. The Earl's only daughter subsequently married Charles II's illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy. As the years went by, the Fitzroys had a little good luck in politics. Henry's grandson eventually became prime minister, and by Act of Parliament in 1768, the ownership of the land was permanently placed in the hands of the Fitzroy clan. The area developed. Open fields gave way to more and more buildings, including in 1883 a building that debuted as the Fitzroy Coffee House. 4 years later, it was converted into a pub and named the 100 Marks in recognition of the many German immigrants living in the area. Fast forward now to 1919, when the pub caught the eye of one Judah Kleinfeld, a successful Savile Row tailor. His German-sounding name and accent, while being a naturalized British citizen, convinced the brewery that owned the pub Judah was the man to take the publican role in this locale replete with German immigrants. But the first thing Judah did was change the name. With the First World War barely in the rearview mirror, he thought not having a German reference in the pub's moniker might be wise. So the newly named Fitzroy Tavern began operation in March 1919. Judah's 3 sons were in military service, so the brewer owner gave special permission to Judah's 16-year-old daughter, Annie, to work in the pub. Good thing. Judah was a great tailor and was to become a great publican, but he couldn't write English. Under Judah's leadership, the pub became the place for writers and artists and sculptors and composers and poets. It was just called the Fitz, and Judah was lovingly referred to as Pop. Annie grew up in the pub and married Charles Allchild, and they eventually took over running the Fitz in 1945. Annie and Charles finally retired in 1956. That ended nearly 4 decades of family control. Samuel Smith's Brewery took over ownership and operation of the pub in the years that followed. Annie and Charles Allchild's daughter, Sally Fiber, wrote what she termed an autobiography of the pub in 1995, and it contains lots of great stories. I'll refer to Sally's book quite a bit here. Lots to choose from. In fact, there are so many folks that were known to frequent the Fitz, figuring out how to tell the tale is a little daunting. I think the best way to begin is to focus on the 2 people who were fundamental to the pub achieving its long list of famous customers. The first person was Nita Hamnett, a Welsh artist and writer who became known as the Queen of Bohemia. Nina was born in 1890, educated in London and later Paris. She seemed immediately attracted to the libertine bohemian life. She associated with prominent artists in both cities, but her fame as a bohemian really started in Paris. She once danced nude on a Montparnasse cafe table, recalling that she had done it just for the hell of it. She was openly bisexual at a time when that raised eyebrows, but she was not just what we might call today an influencer. Her art creations, fabric decorations, clothes, murals, and furniture, were starting to become well received. She returned to London in the mid-1920s and saw that London's bohemians were in Fitzrovia. And from then until her death in 1956, Nina became what Sally Fiber described as perhaps the most loyal devotee of the pub. Her constant patronage was a key to attracting like-minded clientele. Sally provides a good description of the rise of the Bohemians starting in the 1920s. The area was acquiring a cosmopolitan flavor from the foreigners living there, mainly French, German, and Italian, and was the nearest equivalent to the Latin Quarter in Paris. Struggling artists and immigrants came looking for cheap lodgings. Studios were plentiful, and the narrow streets were full of pubs and restaurants where they could meet, talk, laugh, borrow money, and get drunk. These then made up the first Fitzrovians, a motley but interesting collection of people. They cultivated an unconventional Bohemian style of living with a healthy contempt for suburban middle-class values. They responded to the jovial personality of the landlord at the Fitzroy Tavern. Remember, this was Sally's grandfather. A special Fitzrovian atmosphere grew, a heady Bohemian mix in contrast to the smarter, more sophisticated Bloomsbury set, the other side of Tottenham Court Road, also distinct from the Sohoites south of Oxford Street, which was described as the Great Divide. The leading light of this artistic community was Nina Hamnett, a legend in her own lifetime, in the words of her biographer. Sally also relates, if Nina was the Queen of Bohemia, then the great portrait painter Augustus John had to be the prince. Augustus became great friends with Pop Kleinfeld. Over his usual drink of double rum and brandy, he engaged in long discussions with Pop on a variety of subjects. Augustus was quoted as saying, "If you haven't visited the Fitzroy, you haven't visited London," and termed the Fitz as the Clapham Junction of the world. Perhaps it's obvious, but Clapham Junction is known for its high volume of trains and passengers. So across the pond, this comment could be translated as the Fitz is the Grand Central Station of the world. Mr. John was an artist heavyweight of his day. He was a Welsh painter, draftsman, and etcher, and for a time was considered the most important artist at work in Britain. He made the cover of Time magazine in 1928 and was Britain's leading portrait painter through the 1920s. He captured famous folks like T.E. Lawrence, Thomas Hardy, William Butler Yeats, George Bernard Shaw, and most famously, fellow Welshman Dylan Thomas. John's portrait of Dylan hangs in Britain's National Portrait Gallery, and all of this fueled by frequent visits to the Fitz for a double rum. So, with the help of Mr. John and Miss Hamnett, the pub flourished with interesting characters. Of course, Sally would also add that her grandfather had a bit to do with it, too. Judah Kleinfeld, we'll call him Pop from here on, everybody else does, changed the Fitz from a derelict public house on the edge of Bloomsbury to a meeting place for artists, writers, public figures, and celebrities. The pub continued to operate throughout the Blitz, but after the war, some felt that the pub's glory years, where it was a place to be, had passed. But looking back from today, I think most would say that that was not the case. During and after the war, the pub's proximity to BBC's broadcast house brought in a new crop of interesting blokes like Dylan Thomas and George Orwell, straight from their on-air time on the Beeb. Let's talk about the famous patron, Dylan Thomas. Sally tells us that Augustus personally felt that possibly Dylan's greatest verses originated in the fetid atmosphere of pubs like the Fitzroy. It was a fact that he left his only copy of Under Milk Wood in the nearby pub, the York Minster, after a drinking session there. Side note, the York Minster is now the French House, a Soho pub on Dean Street. Several times Annie had to throw Dylan out of the Fitzroy, although at this time his drink was still beer. Later, he turned to hard liquor, and Sally attributes that to his untimely death. Sally didn't mention this, but other sources report that Dylan would pen verses on the back of beer mats and hand them out to attractive lady customers. Now, that's a unique pickup approach. Dylan Thomas was barely 39 when he died in early November 1953. Back at the Fitz, Winfred Vaughan Thomas, a Welsh newspaper journalist and radio TV broadcaster who became one of the BBC's most distinguished war correspondents, came into the Fitz one day looking very distressed. He told Annie that Dylan had died in New York. Vaughan Thomas and Dylan went back all the way to their school days in Swansea. It was agreed that a memorial service should be held in the pub that very night. At the end, Vaughan Thomas passed the hat around. In a long-standing tradition of the Fitz, the donations were attached to darts and thrown up to stick in the ceiling. They call this practice pennies from heaven. The darts were collected after closing, and the donations went to charity. Another famous patron was Albert Pierrepoint, who was a good friend of Pop Kleinfeld and Annie and Charles Allchild. Remember, the Allshaws were Pop's daughter and son-in-law who took over running the pub in 1945. Albert had an interesting occupation. He was an English hangman who had executed between 435 and 600 people in his 25-year career that ended in 1956. Albert applied for and was accepted as an assistant executioner by the Prison Commission in 1931. With 4 days training and some paperwork, he became a full-fledged assistant executioner. Evidently, there was a career path in the job. In 1941, he rose to the position of lead executioner. During the war, he was a busy guy with German spies sentenced to death, and then, after the war, consulting on proper technique for the Nuremberg convicts. Albert was paid a per-execution fee plus expenses. So, this was a side gig. His main work was in the delivery business, and later, wait for it, as a publican. He retired from executions in 1956, reportedly a bit miffed that on his last job he got expenses, but not the execution fee when the prisoner was reprieved at the last minute. He maintained his contract addressed this situation and that he was rightfully owed the money. He didn't like a lot of publicity about his job. Sally Fiber remembers Albert as a cheerful and unassuming man who sat her on his knee and sang her nursery rhymes. There was a bit of a brouhaha involving the Fitz and the executioner Pierrepoint. Remember the journalist and MP who is said to have originated the name Fitzrovia, Tom Dryburgh? Sally tells us that Tom was having a lunchtime drink in the Fitz and talking to Charlie Allchild when the door opened and a powerfully built man walked in. He seemed to be a regular, for he strode over to the bar and shook Charlie's hands. Then he shook Tom's. His hand was large and his grip was extraordinarily tight and strong. It was only then that memory clicked for Tom as Charlie introduced him. The newcomer was Pierrepoint the hangman, and it was just 4 hours since those hands had adjusted the rope around the lily-white neck of Ruth Ellis. Ruth Ellis was executed for shooting her boyfriend outside a pub in Hampstead, a story covered in our True Crimes Pubs episode. Ruth was the last woman to be executed in Britain. That was back in 1956. Albert would retire that same year. But the problem came when Dryburgh wrote a piece for People magazine in 1970 entitled, 4 Hours After Ruth Ellis Was Executed, I Shook Hands with Her Hangman. Albert was immediately incensed, saying that he avoided all public outings around the days of execution, so he knows he would not have been in the Fifth that day. Further, Dryburgh's claim that Albert and Charlie discussed how the process went was seen by Pierrepoint as a slur on both himself and Charlie. He was more professional than that, and Charlie would never have engaged in such a conversation. Albert wrote a long letter of protest to the magazine, but from there I don't have further details. In this row, I kind of believe Albert, but who knows? So does Sally Fiber, Charlie's daughter. She thinks Dryburgh didn't have a very good memory. When Charlie and Annie gave up their spot as Fitz publicans in 1956, a party was held to commemorate their last night of leadership. Many notable regulars attended, including famous actors Richard Attenborough and Yolanda Carlo. It was broadcast on the BBC with Wilfred Vaughan Thomas, that was Dylan's longtime buddy, doing the commentary. Ownership of the pub passed to Samuel Smith, and changes were made over the years, mainly to the interior. The place was made more open. I can remember when I first went there in around 2003, I would sit there and look around and say, wow, this is where Orwell and Thomas drank. When Samuel Smith put the pub through a major renovation in 2005, that design being more of a small room, snug type arrangement, I was saddened that George and Dylan's pub was gone forever. But researching for this episode, I found lots of changes occurred since Orwell and Thomas's days of the late 40s. They would probably not have recognized the pub that entered the 21st century. The new design of 2015 appears to be a return to a smaller, more intimate style, you could say Victorian, that is consistent with the one picture of the bar area of the 40s that is in Sally's book. So once again, my congratulations to Samuel Smith on a great refurb job. And it's not just me. CAMRA, the Campaign for Real Ale Group, gave them a Pub Design Award in 2018. With that, we come to the end of the first episode about Fitzrovia. The second episode is available now if you want to keep going. Please consider subscribing, liking, fan mailing, or dropping me a note at historic.london.pubs@gmail.com. Be sure to make the third word pubs plural. And I think historic pub fans know other like-minded folks. So if you're a mind to, pass this podcast over to them. Thanks so much. Until we chat again, cheers.
Today we took a trip back in time at the Fitzroy Tavern, the boozy, beating heart of Fitzrovia's Bohemian past. In this episode, Eric Blair uncovered wild tales of eccentric artists, literary legends, scandalous queens of Bohemia, and even a hangman with a day job at the bar. From beer mats to poetry and pints to public executions, and yes, Eric is right, it really is that kind of pub. This is Andy Meddick, podcast producer, and up next on the Historic London Pubcast, we had so much fun at the Fitz, we're going back to Fitzrovia. This time we're really putting on the Fitz and stopping at 5 Fitzrovia pubs: the Wheatsheaf, the Marquis of Granby, the Duke of York, the Newman Arms, and the Museum Tavern. We're going to be taking poet Tamby's advice. Don't get Soho-itis and just hang over there in Fitzrovia. In the meantime, remember, every pub has a story to tell if you know where to look.